Billionaire invited his ex-wife for Christmas to show he moved on, until she arrived with a baby. Welcome to Secrets Narrated. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. When the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10 and share what you felt along the way. And if you enjoy emotional stories filled with twists and hidden truths, make sure to follow Secrets Narrated so you don't miss the next one. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy every detail. The December wind cut through Manhattan's Upper East Side as Thomas Reed stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor of Reed International Hotels. At 47, he commanded respect in every boardroom he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with steel gray hair that had started silvering at his temples 5 years ago, and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. His custom-tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly over his still athletic frame, a testament to the discipline that had built his hospitality empire from a single boutique hotel in Boston to a global chain worth $3 billion. But today, discipline felt like a costume he wore to convince himself he was fine. Thomas picked up the cream-colored invitation from his mahogany desk, running his thumb over the embossed golden letters. The Reed family Christmas gathering, an annual tradition that had continued even after his world shifted 1 year and 3 months ago. He hadn't spoken to Audrey Collins, his ex-wife, since their divorce was finalized. The separation had been civilized, almost eerily so. No screaming matches, no bitter custody battles over assets, no public drama that would feed the gossip columns. Just two people who had quietly acknowledged that the life they'd built together had somehow become a beautiful prison for both of them. Audrey had been 34 when they divorced, a brilliant curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with auburn hair that caught light like copper, intelligent green eyes, and a laugh that could fill any room. She was sophisticated, yet approachable, the kind of woman who could discuss Renaissance art with donors at a gala and then spend her Saturday afternoon reading to children at the local library. Thomas had fallen in love with her curiosity about the world, her passion for preserving history, and the way she'd listened to his dreams about expanding the business into Europe with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. But somewhere along the way, her dreams had gotten smaller while his got bigger. Museum events became secondary to investor dinners. Her exhibition openings were postponed when he needed her to accompany him to Dubai or Singapore. She never complained. Audrey wasn't the type to demand or manipulate. She simply adapted, like water finding its way around stone, until one day Thomas realized he hadn't asked her about her work in months. The conversation that ended their marriage lasted 3 hours and felt like 3 minutes. They sat in their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, and Audrey spoke with the same thoughtful care she used to describe a Monet painting. "I love you, Thomas. I always will," she had said, her hands folded in her lap. "But I don't love who I've become in this marriage, and I don't think you love who you've become either." She'd been right, of course. Audrey was always right about the important things. Now, holding the Christmas invitation, Thomas wondered if sending it was an act of maturity or masochism. His sister Margaret had insisted on including Audrey on the guest list. She was part of this family for 6 years, Margaret had argued during their weekly phone call. Longer than some of my college friendships. The divorce doesn't erase that. But Thomas knew his real motivation had nothing to do with family tradition. He wanted Audrey to see that he was fine. More than fine. He was thriving. The business had expanded into 3 new markets since their divorce. He'd lost 15 pounds, started sailing again, and had been photographed at several high-profile charity events with different accomplished women. Not relationships exactly, but evidence that Thomas Reed was moving forward. The invitation was proof. "See, Audrey, I don't need our marriage to be whole." His assistant, Janet, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned over 15 years of anticipating his needs before he voiced them. "The invitation was delivered to Miss Collins this morning," Janet reported, setting a cup of coffee on his desk. Her assistant confirmed receipt. Thomas nodded, surprised by the slight acceleration of his heartbeat. He'd expected relief, but instead felt like he'd just jumped out of a plane and wasn't sure if his parachute would open. 3 days passed before Audrey's response arrived, not through assistance or formal correspondence, but via a simple text message to his personal phone, a number he wasn't even sure still worked. "Thomas, thank you for including me. I'd love to see your family again. I'll be there." Audrey Thomas read the message 17 times, analyzing each word like a contract negotiation. The tone was warm but not intimate, grateful but not needy. She'd signed with her name instead of any term of endearment, but she'd also remembered how much his family meant to him. That evening, Thomas called Margaret to confirm Audrey's acceptance. "I'm surprised she said yes," he admitted, loosening his tie as he walked through his apartment. "I thought she might find an excuse to decline." "Why would you think that?" Margaret's voice carried that particular note of sisterly irritation that meant he'd missed something obvious. "Audrey loved our family, Thomas. She probably missed us." The word "missed" settled uncomfortably in Thomas's chest. He'd constructed this entire scenario around proving his independence, but it hadn't occurred to him that Audrey might have her own complex feelings about seeing them again. 2 weeks later, on December 23rd, Thomas stood in his childhood home in Greenwich, Connecticut, watching his mother direct the catering staff with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. The house looked like something from a magazine. Garlands draped perfectly along the banister, a 12-foot Douglas fir in the living room adorned with ornaments collected over 4 decades of Reed family Christmases, and enough food to feed half of Connecticut. His brother David arrived first with his wife and twin daughters, followed by Margaret and her husband, then various cousins and close family friends. The house filled with laughter and conversation, the familiar chaos of a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Thomas found himself checking his watch every few minutes, though Audrey wasn't expected until 7. He moved through the rooms, playing the gracious host, accepting compliments on his recent success, deflecting questions about his personal life with practiced charm. Everything was going according to plan. At 7:15, the doorbell rang. Thomas was in the kitchen reviewing tomorrow's brunch menu with the caterer when he heard Margaret's delighted exclamation from the foyer. "Audrey, oh my God, you look beautiful." Something in his chest tightened. Not anxiety exactly, but anticipation mixed with something he couldn't name. Thomas straightened his navy cashmere sweater and walked toward the front of the house, preparing to greet his ex-wife with the perfect balance of warmth and emotional distance. He rounded the corner into the foyer and stopped breathing. Audrey stood there, radiant in a forest green dress that brought out her eyes, her auburn hair styled in soft waves around her shoulders. She was hugging Margaret, laughing at something his sister had said, looking exactly like the woman he'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, except for the tiny baby nestled securely in her arms. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old, with a cap of dark hair and rosebud lips, sleeping peacefully against Audrey's chest, as if the whole world was just background noise to the safety of her embrace. Thomas felt the floor of his carefully constructed evening crack beneath his feet. Audrey looked up and met his eyes across the foyer, and in that moment, he realized his invitation hadn't been about proving he'd moved on. How could he have moved on from someone he'd never really understood at all? Time seemed suspended in the foyer like dust motes caught in afternoon light. Thomas watched Audrey shift the baby slightly, adjusting the soft yellow blanket with the unconscious grace of someone who had performed this motion hundreds of times. The infant stirred briefly, one tiny fist escaping the blanket to wave in the air before settling back against Audrey's chest. Margaret was already reaching for the baby, her maternal instincts overriding any awareness of the tension crackling through the room. "Oh, Audrey, who is this little angel?" "This is Emma," Audrey said, her voice carrying that particular tenderness reserved for introducing something precious. "She's 3 months old." 3 months. Thomas's mind immediately began calculating backwards, a habit from years of business negotiations where timing meant everything. 3 months meant Audrey had been pregnant during their divorce proceedings. 3 months meant she'd been carrying this secret while they sat in lawyers' offices dividing assets and discussing the dissolution of their life together. But as he watched Audrey's face, serene, proud, completely at ease, Thomas realized his calculations were missing something fundamental. There was no guilt in her expression, no defensive posture of someone hiding a betrayal. Instead, there was the quiet confidence of a woman who had made a deliberate choice and was completely at peace with it. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered, gently stroking Emma's cheek. "Look at those perfect little fingers. Thomas, come meet Emma." Walking across the foyer felt like moving through water. Thomas approached slowly, his business instincts warning him that this moment would somehow change everything, though he couldn't articulate how. Up close he could see that Emma had Audrey's delicate features but darker hair, almost black, with the kind of curl that would probably torment her as a teenager. "Hello, Emma," Thomas said softly, surprised by how natural it felt to lower his voice to match the peaceful atmosphere the baby created around herself. Emma opened her eyes at the sound, revealing deep brown irises that seemed far too wise for someone who had only existed in the world for 3 months. She looked at Thomas with the frank curiosity of someone meeting a stranger, no recognition or expectation in her gaze. "She's very social," Audrey said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "She loves meeting new people. I think she's going to be one of those children who talks to everyone at the grocery store." The casual intimacy in Audrey's voice when she spoke about Emma's personality hit Thomas unexpectedly. This wasn't the tentative affection of a new mother still learning her child's patterns. This was deep knowledge, the kind that came from countless nights of feeding schedules and diaper changes, from watching every small development and filing it away as proof of who this little person was becoming. Audrey, Thomas's mother, Eleanor Reed, swept into the foyer with the elegant authority of someone who had hosted presidents and foreign dignitaries at her dinner table. At 72, Eleanor remained a striking woman, silver hair styled in a classic bob, wearing a cream-colored cashmere cardigan that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. But when she saw Audrey holding Emma, her sophisticated composure cracked into genuine delight. "My dear girl, you didn't tell us." Eleanor embraced them both carefully, mindful of the sleeping baby. "When? How? Oh, she's absolutely perfect." "Mom," Thomas started, but Eleanor waved him off with the dismissive gesture she'd perfected during his childhood. "Thomas, don't hover. David, come meet Audrey's daughter," Eleanor called toward the living room, where the sounds of conversation and laughter suggested the rest of the family remained blissfully unaware of the small earthquake happening in the foyer. David appeared with his wife Sarah and their 8-year-old twins, Emma and Grace. The girls immediately gravitated toward baby Emma with the magnetic attraction children felt toward anything smaller than themselves. "Can we hold her?" Grace asked, bouncing slightly on her toes. "After dinner," Audrey promised. "She'll probably be awake then and ready to play." Sarah, who had navigated enough family gatherings to recognize undercurrents, stepped smoothly into the role of diplomatic hostess. "Audrey, you must be exhausted from traveling with a baby. Can I show you where you can change her if needed? We set up the guest room upstairs with everything you might need." As the group began moving toward the living room, Thomas found himself walking beside Audrey, close enough to catch the familiar scent of her perfume, something light and floral that she'd worn since their second date. But underneath it was something new, the faint sweet smell of baby powder and that indefinable scent of infant that somehow triggered protective instincts even in strangers. "She's beautiful, Audrey," Thomas said quietly, his voice carefully neutral. "Truly." Audrey glanced at him, and for a moment he saw something flicker across her face. Not guilt or defiance, but perhaps a kind of sadness. "Thank you. She's the best thing I've ever done." The simplicity of her statement hit him like a physical blow. Not the best thing that had happened to her, but the best thing she had done. Active, intentional, chosen. They entered the living room where the Christmas tree dominated one corner, its lights casting warm golden shadows across the assembled family. Thomas watched as Audrey moved through the room, accepting congratulations and answering questions with the same calm grace she'd brought to museum fundraisers and corporate events. But now there was something different in her demeanor, a centeredness that hadn't been there during their marriage. When someone asked about Emma's father, Audrey's response was matter-of-fact. "I chose to do this on my own." Emma was very much wanted and very much planned. Thomas found himself studying the faces around the room, watching his family process this information. His mother nodded approvingly. Eleanor Reed respected decisive action, regardless of convention. Margaret looked unsurprised, as if she'd somehow sensed this possibility. David and Sarah exchanged a quick glance that suggested they'd probably discuss this development during their drive home. But it was his niece's reaction that caught Thomas off guard. 9-year-old Emma looked fascinated rather than confused. "So you just decided you wanted a baby and had one?" she asked with the directness that made adults uncomfortable. "It's more complicated than that," Audrey explained patiently. "But essentially, yes. Sometimes adults make the decision to become parents even when they're not married." "That's smart," Grace declared with 8-year-old certainty. "My friend Chloe's mom did that too. Chloe says it's actually better because her mom didn't have to compromise on anything important." The adults in the room laughed, but Thomas felt something twist in his chest. Compromise. Had Audrey felt like their entire marriage was a series of compromises that slowly eroded who she wanted to be? Dinner was announced, and the family moved toward the dining room with the comfortable chaos of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Thomas found himself seated across from Audrey, who had positioned Emma's car seat beside her chair so she could monitor the baby while eating. As conversation flowed around the table, updates on work, discussions of vacation plans, gentle family gossip, Thomas found himself watching Audrey with an intensity that bordered on scientific observation. She participated naturally in the conversation while simultaneously tracking Emma's sleep patterns, occasionally adjusting the blanket or checking her tiny fingers for temperature. It was a kind of elegant multitasking that spoke to how completely she'd adapted to motherhood. Halfway through the main course, Emma began to fuss. Soft sounds that probably weren't audible to anyone else, but Audrey immediately noticed. "Excuse me," she said quietly, lifting Emma from the car seat. "Someone's dinner time too." Eleanor stood immediately. "Use the library, dear, it's quiet and private." Thomas watched Audrey disappear down the hallway, Emma already calming in her arms, and realized that in all their years together, he'd never seen Audrey look as naturally confident as she had in that moment. Not uncertain, not apologetic, not asking permission, just a woman who knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. "She looks happy," Margaret said quietly, following his gaze. "Yes," Thomas agreed, though the word felt inadequate. "She does." What he didn't say was that Audrey looked like someone who had finally found the life she was meant to be living, and that realization was far more unsettling than any jealousy or anger would have been. Because if Audrey had needed to leave their marriage to become this version of herself, what did that say about the 6 years they'd spent together? The library had always been Thomas's refuge during childhood. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves lined with first editions and family photographs, leather armchairs positioned near the fireplace, and tall windows that overlooked his mother's prize-winning rose garden. Now, standing in the doorway, he watched Audrey settle into the wingback chair by the window, Emma cradled against her chest with a familiarity that spoke of countless feeding sessions. Audrey looked up when she sensed his presence, and for the first time that evening, something uncertain flickered across her face. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt, I just wanted to check if you needed anything." "It's fine," Audrey replied, though she adjusted Emma's position slightly, creating a more private cocoon. "She's almost finished anyway." Thomas hesitated in the doorway, caught between the politeness of leaving and an inexplicable need to understand what he was witnessing. This intimate domestic scene felt both foreign and familiar. Foreign because he'd never seen Audrey in this maternal role. Familiar because the setting was the same room where they'd spent countless evenings during visits to his family home. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the chair across from her. Audrey nodded, and Thomas settled into the leather chair where he'd once read bedtime stories to his nieces, where he'd proposed to Audrey 7 years ago on a snowy December evening much like this one. The irony of the location wasn't lost on him. Emma had finished eating and was now gazing around the room with that alert curiosity babies displayed when they were content and well-fed. Audrey lifted her to her shoulder, beginning the gentle patting ritual that Thomas remembered watching his sister-in-law perform with his nieces. "She's very calm," Thomas observed, genuinely impressed by Emma's easy temperament. David's twins were much more demanding at this age. Audrey smiled, the first completely relaxed expression he'd seen from her since she arrived. "She has her moments, believe me. But yes, she's generally pretty easygoing. The pediatrician says some babies are just born with a naturally sunny disposition." "Like her mother," Thomas said without thinking, then felt heat rise in his face. The comment was too intimate, too much of a callback to their shared past. But Audrey didn't seem uncomfortable. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "I wasn't always sunny, Thomas. You know that." She was right, of course. During the last 2 years of their marriage, Audrey had grown increasingly quiet, more likely to agree than to offer her own opinion, more inclined to adapt her schedule to his than to advocate for her own needs. He'd attributed it to the natural evolution of a long-term relationship, the way couples learn to accommodate each other's rhythms. Now, watching her confident ease with Emma, he wondered if what he'd interpreted as harmony had actually been Audrey slowly disappearing. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said, his business instincts warning him that this was dangerous territory, but his personal curiosity overriding caution. Audrey adjusted Emma against her shoulder, buying herself a moment before responding. "Depends on the question. When did you decide? About having a baby, I mean." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Audrey was quiet for so long that Thomas began to regret asking, but finally she spoke. "About 6 months after our divorce was finalized," she said carefully. "I was in therapy, which I probably should have done years earlier, and my therapist asked me what I wanted my life to look like in 5 years. I realized I'd never actually asked myself that question before. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. In 6 years of marriage, had he ever asked Audrey what she wanted her life to look like? Or had he simply assumed she'd want whatever future he was building for them? I'd always wanted children, Audrey continued, her voice taking on the thoughtful tone he remembered from their early dates when she'd explained the historical significance of a painting or sculpture. But somewhere along the way, that want got postponed. First, we wanted to establish our careers. Then you were expanding into international markets. Then there was always another business milestone that needed to be reached first. I thought we both agreed, Thomas started, but Audrey held up a gentle hand. We did agree. Every time. I agreed because I wanted to be supportive, because I believed in your vision, because I thought there would always be time later. She paused, adjusting Emma's blanket with the automatic precision of someone whose hands knew exactly what to do. But therapy helped me realize that I was waiting for permission to want what I wanted, and the only person who could give me that permission was me. Emma made a soft sound. Not distress, just the kind of sleepy murmur that indicated she was ready to drift off again. Audrey shifted her to the crook of her arm, and Thomas watched Emma's eyes flutter closed with the complete trust of someone who had never known anything but safety. So you decided to do it alone, Thomas said, trying to keep any judgment out of his voice. I decided to do it intentionally, Audrey corrected. I researched fertility clinics, spoke with counselors, planned financially for single parenthood. I thought about it for 8 months before I made the appointment. This wasn't an impulse decision, Thomas. It was the most carefully considered choice I've ever made. Thomas found himself studying Audrey's face as she spoke, noting the quiet pride in her voice, the way her shoulders had straightened when she described her decision-making process. This was a version of Audrey he'd never encountered. Decisive, self-assured, willing to take risks for something she wanted rather than waiting for the perfect moment that might never come. Does she know? He asked, then immediately regretted the phrasing. I mean, will you tell her about about the process? Audrey's smile was warm, but firm. Of course, age appropriately, when she's ready to understand. I want Emma to know that she was desperately wanted, carefully planned for, and that choosing to become her mother was the best decision I ever made. There's nothing shameful about any part of her story. The certainty in Audrey's voice made something ache in Thomas's chest. When had she become so clear about her values, so unafraid to stand behind her choices? During their marriage, he'd often found himself making decisions for both of them, assuming he was being protective rather than controlling. Now he wondered if what he'd called leadership had actually been a slow erosion of Audrey's confidence in her own judgment. Your family is being wonderful about this, Audrey said, shifting the conversation away from the more charged territory they'd been navigating. I wasn't sure how they'd react. They love you, Thomas said simply. The divorce didn't change that. Audrey looked at him directly then, and Thomas felt the full force of her attention in a way he hadn't experienced in years. What about you, Thomas? How are you reacting? The question caught him off guard, probably because he'd been so focused on trying to appear unaffected that he hadn't actually examined his own emotional response. How was he reacting? Surprised, certainly. Unsettled in ways he couldn't quite articulate. But underneath those surface reactions was something more complex, a kind of mourning for possibilities he'd never even realized existed. Thomas paused, searching for honesty rather than diplomacy. I'm realizing there was a lot about you I never understood. Audrey's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with, curious, engaged, willing to explore difficult conversations rather than avoid them. We were very young when we got married, she said gently. I'm not sure either of us understood who we were well enough to help the other person understand us. Emma stirred against Audrey's chest, making the kind of small sounds that indicated she was transitioning between sleep cycles. Audrey began the gentle swaying motion that seemed to be hardwired into every mother's muscle memory. I should probably get her back to the car seat, Audrey said. She sleeps better when she's not being held constantly. Thomas stood as Audrey rose from her chair, and for a moment they were standing close enough that he could see the tiny freckles across her nose that had appeared during their honeymoon in Italy, close enough to notice that she'd changed perfumes. This one was warmer, more confident than the delicate floral scent she'd worn during their marriage. Audrey, he said as she moved toward the door. She turned back, Emma sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. You look happy, Thomas said. the words coming out more vulnerable than he'd intended. Really happy. I just wanted you to know that I can see it. Something shifted in Audrey's expression. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly. I am happy. For the first time in a long time, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. As Thomas watched her walk back toward the dining room, Emma secure in her arms, he realized that his carefully planned evening had already gone completely off script. He'd invited Audrey to prove that he'd moved on, that he was thriving without their marriage. Instead, he was beginning to understand that the real question wasn't whether he'd moved on from Audrey. It was whether he'd ever really known her at all. When Thomas returned to the dining room, the conversation had shifted to David's latest sailing adventure in the Caribbean. His brother was describing a particularly challenging day when they'd encountered unexpected weather, using the animated hand gestures that always accompanied his best stories. The family listened with the indulgent attention of people who'd heard similar tales before, but still enjoyed David's enthusiasm. Audrey had settled back into her seat, Emma now sleeping peacefully in her car seat beside the table. Thomas noticed how naturally Audrey participated in the conversation, while simultaneously monitoring Emma's breathing patterns, occasionally adjusting the blanket with movements so subtle they were almost unconscious. It was a kind of elegant multitasking that spoke to how completely motherhood had integrated into her identity. Remember when Thomas capsized his sunfish when he was 14? Margaret was saying, grinning at her brother. Dad had to rescue him with the motorboat because he was too embarrassed to swim to shore in front of the sailing instructor. I was not embarrassed, Thomas protested, settling back into his chair. I was being strategic. The water was freezing. You were being dramatic, Eleanor corrected with the fond exasperation of a mother who'd witnessed decades of her children's various attempts at maintaining dignity. You sat on that overturned boat for 20 minutes like you were waiting for the Coast Guard. The family's laughter felt warm and familiar, the kind of gentle teasing that came from a lifetime of shared experiences. Thomas found himself relaxing into the rhythm of it, until he noticed Audrey watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. During their marriage, Audrey had always seemed slightly outside these family moments, not unwelcome, but not quite native to their particular brand of affectionate chaos. She'd participated politely, laughed at the right moments, but Thomas had always sensed a reserve in her, as if she were translating the experience rather than simply living it. Now, though, she looked completely at ease, not performing belonging, but actually belonging. What about you, Audrey? Sarah asked, cutting into a slice of Eleanor's famous apple tart. Any sailing disasters in your past? Audrey smiled, shifting slightly so she could see Emma while talking. I'm actually a terrible sailor. The one time Thomas took me out on his boat, I spent the entire afternoon convinced we were going to capsize. I think I may have left permanent finger marks on the safety rail. That's not true, Thomas said, surprised by the memory surfacing so clearly. You loved it once you relaxed. You said the water looked like liquid emeralds. I did say that, Audrey agreed, and something in her tone made Thomas look at her more carefully. I had forgotten you remembered. The comment hung in the air with unexpected weight. Thomas realized he'd been unconsciously cataloging moments like this all evening. Small details about Audrey that he'd stored away without thinking about them. Fragments of their shared history that apparently meant more to him than he'd admitted to himself. Speaking of sailing, David interjected, clearly sensing the conversational current needed redirecting. Thomas, are you still planning that yacht charter in the Mediterranean this spring? Thomas had completely forgotten about the trip he'd booked 6 months ago. A sailing tour through the Greek islands that was supposed to represent his liberation from married life, his return to the adventures he'd enjoyed before settling down. Yes, he said automatically, though I'm not sure about the timing anymore. Business conflicts? Eleanor asked with the knowing tone of someone whose son had been canceling personal plans for business reasons his entire adult life. Thomas started to nod, then caught himself. The truth was that the idea of sailing through the Mediterranean alone, or with whatever attractive companion he might invite, no longer held the appeal it had when he'd made the reservation. Somewhere between booking the trip and this moment, his vision of what constituted an ideal vacation had shifted in ways he couldn't quite explain. Just reconsidering, he said finally. Emma stirred in her car seat, making soft sounds that weren't quite crying but indicated she was transitioning back toward wakefulness. Audrey immediately leaned over, her attention shifting with the automatic focus of someone whose primary responsibility was always listening for these subtle cues. Someone's ready for her evening social hour, Audrey said, lifting Emma from the car seat with practiced efficiency. Emma's eyes opened, bright and alert. scanning the faces around the table with the frank curiosity Thomas was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "May I hold her?" Eleanor asked, extending her arms with the confidence of a woman who'd successfully raised 3 children and helped with numerous grandchildren. Audrey transferred Emma to Eleanor's arms, and Thomas watched his mother's face transform as she looked down at the baby. Eleanor had always been elegant, controlled, the kind of woman who could host a dinner party for 30 without breaking a sweat. But holding Emma brought out something softer, more unguarded. "Hello, beautiful girl," Eleanor murmured, automatically beginning the gentle swaying motion that seemed to be universal among women who'd spent time with infants. "Aren't you just perfect?" Emma stared up at Eleanor with solemn attention, as if she were memorizing this new face for future reference. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not gas, not a reflexive expression, but a genuine social smile that lit up her entire face. The effect on the table was immediate. Even David, who was typically more interested in boats than babies, leaned forward to get a better look. "She's flirting with you, Mom," Margaret laughed. "Look at that smile. She knows quality when she sees it," Eleanor said with mock seriousness, though her voice was warm with genuine delight. "Smart girl." Thomas found himself studying the scene with an intensity that surprised him. This was what he'd imagined when he'd sent the invitation. His family, his home, everyone gathered around his table sharing affection and laughter. But he'd envisioned himself at the center of it, the successful host who'd created this perfect evening. Instead, he felt like an observer at his own gathering, watching Audrey integrate seamlessly into his family's dynamics, while he struggled to understand his place in the picture. "She's beautiful, Audrey," his father said quietly. Robert Reed rarely spoke during family dinners, preferring to listen and observe, but when he offered an opinion, everyone paid attention. "You can see the intelligence in her eyes already." "Thank you," Audrey said, and Thomas could hear the genuine pleasure in her voice. "She's very alert. The pediatrician says she's meeting all her developmental milestones early." Pride. That was what Thomas heard in Audrey's voice. The quiet satisfaction of someone who'd taken on an enormous responsibility and was succeeding at it. During their marriage, Thomas wasn't sure he'd ever heard Audrey speak about her own achievements with such unqualified confidence. "What's her schedule like?" Sarah asked with the practical curiosity of an experienced mother. "Is she sleeping through the night yet?" As Audrey launched into a detailed description of Emma's sleep patterns, feeding schedule, and emerging personality traits, Thomas realized he was witnessing something he'd never seen during their marriage. Audrey holding court. Not performing or accommodating or deferring to others' expertise, but speaking with authority about something she knew intimately and cared about deeply. He tried to remember if there had ever been a subject during their marriage that had brought out this kind of confident expertise in Audrey. Art history, certainly. She could discuss Renaissance techniques or modern installations with the same kind of detailed knowledge she was now applying to infant development. But had he ever really listened when she talked about her work? Or had he been waiting for his turn to speak, mentally preparing his own contributions to the conversation? Emma began to fuss slightly in Eleanor's arms, and Audrey immediately stood. "She's probably ready for a diaper change," she explained, accepting Emma back from Eleanor. "Could I use one of the upstairs bedrooms?" "Of course, dear," Eleanor said. "The guest room has everything you need." As Audrey headed upstairs with Emma, the conversation continued around the table, but Thomas found his attention fragmenting. He was physically present but mentally following Audrey's footsteps to the second floor, imagining her settling Emma on the bed, talking to her in the soft narrating voice he'd overheard mothers use when they were alone with their babies. "You're being awfully quiet tonight," Margaret observed, leaning closer to Thomas. "Everything all right?" Thomas realized he'd been staring at the empty doorway where Audrey had disappeared. "Fine," he said, forcing his attention back to the table. "Just thinking." "About?" The honest answer was too complicated to explain at a family dinner. He was thinking about the version of Audrey he was discovering tonight, confident, decisive, genuinely happy, and wondering if she'd always been capable of becoming this person, or if leaving their marriage had somehow unlocked qualities that had been dormant during their years together. He was thinking about the Mediterranean sailing trip he'd booked as a symbol of his independence, and wondering why the idea now felt hollow rather than exciting. He was thinking about the way Audrey had looked at Emma in the library, not just with love, but with the deep satisfaction of someone who'd found exactly what they were meant to be doing with their life. "Just family stuff," Thomas said finally, which was true enough. Margaret studied his face with the penetrating attention of someone who'd been reading her brother's moods for 47 years. "Thomas," she said quietly, so the conversation wouldn't carry to the rest of the table. You know this doesn't change anything, right? Audrey having a baby doesn't reflect on you or your marriage. People's lives move forward in different directions. The kindness in his sister's voice made something tight in Thomas's chest loosen slightly. Margaret was trying to offer comfort, assuming he was struggling with jealousy or feeling displaced by Audrey's new role as a mother. But that wasn't quite right. Thomas wasn't jealous of Emma or resentful of Audrey's happiness. If anything, seeing Audrey so clearly thriving should have validated his decision to end their marriage, should have proven that they'd both been right to recognize their incompatibility. Instead, he felt like he was mourning something he'd never even realized he'd lost. The sound of Audrey's footsteps on the stairs drew his attention back to the doorway. She appeared a moment later with Emma, who was now wide awake and looking around the room with bright interest. Someone's ready for her public, Audrey announced, and Thomas could see the genuine joy in her expression as she looked at her daughter. As Audrey settled back at the table and Emma was passed around for more admiration, Thomas realized what he was really mourning. Not the end of his marriage, but the recognition that he'd never truly understood the woman he'd been married to. And now, watching her navigate motherhood with such natural grace, he was beginning to suspect he'd lost something far more valuable than he'd ever imagined. After dinner, the family migrated to the living room for what Eleanor called proper Christmas socializing, an evening ritual that involved coffee, cognac, and the kind of relaxed conversation that only happened when people had nowhere else they needed to be. The Christmas tree dominated the space, its lights casting warm shadows across the Persian rugs and antique furniture that had been in the Reed family for 3 generations. Thomas found himself positioned near the fireplace, a crystal tumbler of aged cognac in his hand, watching as Emma became the evening's undisputed center of attention. She was fully awake now, alert and social, charming his normally reserved father into making silly faces and coaxing delighted laughter from his nieces. She's going to be spoiled rotten, Audrey said with mock concern, settling onto the sofa near Thomas's chair. Emma was currently captivating David, who was attempting to teach her to give high fives despite her obvious inability to coordinate such a complex gesture. Good, Eleanor declared from her position near the tree. Babies should be spoiled. There's plenty of time for discipline later. Thomas watched Audrey's face as she observed Emma's interactions with his family, noting the quiet satisfaction in her expression. This wasn't the anxious monitoring of a new mother worried about her child's behavior. This was someone watching their carefully considered life plan unfold exactly as they'd hoped. She's very social, Thomas observed, genuinely impressed by Emma's apparent comfort with strangers. Is that typical for her age? Audrey turned toward him, and Thomas was struck by how natural it felt to be discussing Emma's development with her, as if they were co-conspirators in appreciating this remarkable small person, rather than virtual strangers connected only by shared history. Her pediatrician says some babies are just naturally extroverted, Audrey explained. She's been like this since birth, curious about faces, responsive to voices. I think she's going to be one of those children who makes friends everywhere she goes. The pride in Audrey's voice when she talked about Emma was unmistakable, but it was pride without the desperate edge Thomas sometimes heard from parents who seemed to need their children's achievements to validate their own choices. Audrey spoke about Emma the way art historians discussed a masterpiece they'd been privileged to study, with deep appreciation, but no sense of ownership. Have you thought about going back to the Met? Thomas asked, then immediately wished he could retract the question. It was too personal, too much of a callback to their shared past when Audrey's career had been a frequent source of discussion between them. But Audrey didn't seem uncomfortable with the question. Actually, I've been consulting with smaller galleries, she said. Projects I can manage from home, at least while Emma's young. It turns out there's a lot of demand for someone who can authenticate pieces and write catalog essays without requiring a traditional office schedule. Thomas felt a familiar flicker of what he recognized as professional admiration. During their marriage, Audrey had been one of the most respected junior curators at the Metropolitan Museum, known for her meticulous research and her ability to spot forgeries that fooled more experienced collectors. She'd given up a promotion opportunity when Thomas's business expansion required more travel, and though she'd never complained, Thomas now wondered if that sacrifice had been the beginning of a slow erosion of her professional identity. That's smart, Thomas said. Flexible but still using your expertise. It's perfect, actually, Audrey replied, and Thomas could hear genuine contentment in her voice. I get to work with beautiful objects, contribute to the art world, and still be present for Emma's development. I never thought I'd be able to have both. The phrase hung between them with uncomfortable weight. Thomas realized that during their marriage, Audrey probably had believed she'd never be able to have both career satisfaction and motherhood, not because the combination was impossible, but because the life they'd built together hadn't allowed space for her to pursue both simultaneously. Emma made a happy gurgling sound from David's lap, drawing everyone's attention. She was reaching toward the Christmas tree lights with the focused intensity of someone discovering that the world contained beautiful, inexplicable things. "She loves lights," Audrey said, moving to retrieve Emma before she could grab anything fragile. "We spend a lot of time looking at the Christmas decorations in our neighborhood. She gets very serious about studying all the colors." "Where are you living now?" Margaret asked as Audrey settled Emma back against her chest. "Upper West Side," Audrey replied. "A 2-bedroom near the park. It's smaller than what Thomas and I had, but it's perfect for Emma and me. Lots of natural light for her to look at, close to the pediatrician, and there's a playground 3 blocks away for when she's older." Thomas knew the building she was describing, a pre-war structure with high ceilings and original hardwood floors. During their marriage, they'd lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, all marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows with views of Central Park. Beautiful, certainly, but not particularly warm. Audrey's current apartment sounded like a home rather than a showcase. "And you're managing financially?" Eleanor asked with the practical concern of someone who'd raised children during leaner times. "Consulting work can be unpredictable." Thomas tensed slightly, recognizing this as potentially sensitive territory. During their divorce, he'd been generous with the settlement. More than generous, actually. But he'd also known that Audrey's earning potential as a museum curator was limited compared to his business income. "I'm doing well," Audrey said simply. "I planned carefully before Emma was born, and the consulting work pays better than I expected. Plus, I have fewer expenses now. No need for the kind of wardrobe I needed for corporate events, no pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle. It's liberating, actually." Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the word pressure. Had Audrey felt pressure during their marriage to maintain a lifestyle that didn't feel natural to her? He'd thought he was providing for her, creating opportunities for them to enjoy the success his business had generated. Now he wondered if what he'd experienced as generosity, Audrey had experienced as obligation. "There's something to be said for simplicity," Robert observed quietly. Thomas's father had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, his comments carried the weight of considered thought. "Too many options can make it harder to appreciate what you have." Audrey smiled at Robert with genuine warmth. "Exactly. I know what my priorities are now, and everything else feels optional rather than essential." The conversation continued around them, Margaret asking about Emma's sleep schedule, David sharing stories about his twins' latest adventures, Eleanor planning tomorrow's breakfast menu. But Thomas found himself mentally cataloging the differences between this version of Audrey and the woman he'd been married to. This Audrey spoke with quiet authority about her choices. This Audrey seemed to take up exactly the amount of space she needed rather than shrinking to accommodate others' expectations. This Audrey looked directly at people when she talked to them, instead of glancing at Thomas to gauge his reaction to her contributions. "I should probably start thinking about heading home soon," Audrey said as Emma began showing signs of evening fussiness. "Someone's going to want her bedtime routine." "You're welcome to stay," Eleanor offered immediately. "The guest room is ready, and it might be easier than driving back to the city with a tired baby." Thomas felt his pulse quicken at the possibility of Audrey staying overnight, not because he wanted to extend whatever emotional excavation was happening between them, but because the idea of her leaving felt premature. There were too many questions still unasked, too many pieces of understanding that felt just beyond his reach. "That's very kind," Audrey said, "but Emma sleeps better in her own crib, and I have a consultation call tomorrow morning. One of the advantages of working with West Coast galleries is that they accommodate East Coast parenting schedules." She stood, beginning the process of gathering Emma's belongings with the efficient movements of someone who'd mastered the logistics of traveling with an infant. Thomas watched her check the diaper bag, adjust Emma's outfit, and wrap her in the soft blanket that had somehow become essential to the baby's comfort. "I'll walk you to your car," Thomas said, standing as well. Audrey looked at him with mild surprise but nodded. "Thank you." The goodbye process took another 15 minutes. Hugs from everyone, promises to visit again soon, Eleanor pressing leftover dessert into a container for Audrey to take home. Emma accepted all the additional attention with the patient tolerance of someone who'd learned that departures involved a lot of adult inefficiency. Finally, Thomas found himself walking beside Audrey toward her car, a practical SUV that had replaced the sleek sedan she'd driven during their marriage. Emma was secured in her car seat, already drowsing despite the cold air. "Thank you for including me tonight," Audrey said as they reached her car. "Your family has always been important to me." "They love you," Thomas replied, then added more quietly, "We all do." Audrey looked at him directly, and in the glow from the streetlight, Thomas could see something complicated in her expression. Affection, perhaps, but also a kind of gentle sadness. "I know," she said simply, "and I love all of you too. But love isn't always enough, is it?" The question hung in the cold air between them like visible breath. Thomas knew she was referring to their marriage, to the slow dissolution of something that had begun with genuine affection, but had somehow become insufficient to sustain the life they were trying to build together. "Audrey," Thomas said, though he wasn't sure what he wanted to follow the word. She waited, her hand on the car door handle, giving him space to continue if he chose to. "I think I'm finally understanding what I lost," he said, the words coming out more honestly than he'd intended. Audrey's expression softened, but there was no triumph in it, no sense of vindication. Instead, she looked at him with the kind of compassionate clarity that suggested she'd already processed whatever grief she'd needed to feel about their marriage. "You didn't lose me, Thomas," she said gently. "You lost the version of me that I was trying to be for you, but I don't think either of us knew how to let me be who I actually was." She got into her car, started the engine, and drove away into the December night, leaving Thomas standing in his parents' driveway, with the devastating realization that she was absolutely right. Thomas stood in his parents' driveway long after Audrey's taillights disappeared around the corner, the December cold seeping through his cashmere coat without him noticing. Her words echoed in his mind with the devastating clarity of a truth that couldn't be unheard. "You lost the version of me that I was trying to be for you." The front door opened behind him, spilling warm light across the snow-dusted gravel. "Thomas?" Margaret's voice carried the gentle concern of someone who'd witnessed the entire goodbye from the living room window. "You're going to freeze out here." He turned toward his sister, noting the way her expression shifted as she registered whatever she saw in his face. Margaret had always been perceptive about emotional undercurrents, a skill honed by years of managing family dynamics and reading the moods of her teenage daughters. "I'm fine," Thomas said automatically, though they both knew it was a deflection rather than the truth. "Come inside," Margaret said, stepping out onto the porch despite the cold. "Mom's making coffee, and Dad's threatening to break out the photo albums from our childhood. You know how dangerous that gets." Thomas allowed himself to be guided back into the house, but the warmth and familiar comfort of his childhood home felt strangely foreign now. The living room looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. Same Christmas tree, same arrangement of furniture, same family members settling into their usual evening patterns, but something fundamental had shifted in his perception of it all. Eleanor looked up as they entered, her maternal instincts immediately detecting the change in Thomas's demeanor. "Everything all right, dear?" "Just saying goodbye," Thomas replied, settling into his chair by the fireplace. But the words felt inadequate to describe what had actually transpired in those few minutes beside Audrey's car. David, who was helping his daughters with a complex jigsaw puzzle spread across the coffee table, glanced up with the casual attention of someone accustomed to family members having minor emotional moments. "Emma's a charmer. Audrey's done a beautiful job with her." "Yes," Thomas agreed, then found himself adding, "She has." But even as he spoke, Thomas realized he was thinking about more than Audrey's success as a mother. She'd done a beautiful job with her entire life, the careful planning, the thoughtful decision-making, the courage to pursue what she wanted rather than what was expected. Emma was just the most visible evidence of a transformation that had been happening all along. "It must have been strange," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone she used when navigating sensitive family territory, "seeing her with a baby. That's a big change." Thomas looked at Sarah, David's wife, a woman who'd joined the Reed family through marriage and had learned to love them while maintaining her own identity, and realized she might understand his disorientation better than his blood relatives. Sarah had managed to become part of their family without losing herself in the process. Had Audrey been capable of the same balance? Or had something about Thomas specifically made it impossible? "It wasn't strange," Thomas said slowly, testing the honesty of his words as he spoke them. It was clarifying. Margaret raised an eyebrow at his choice of words but didn't push for explanation. The Reed family had always respected each other's need to process emotions at their own pace. Eleanor, however, had less patience for emotional circumnavigation. "Thomas, you look like someone who's had an important realization. Would you like to talk about it?" Thomas considered deflecting again, maintaining the polite fiction that the evening had been simply a pleasant family gathering with no deeper implications. But sitting in this room where he'd spent countless holidays, surrounded by people who'd known him since childhood, pretense felt both pointless and exhausting. "I think," Thomas said carefully, "I'm beginning to understand that I was a different person in my marriage than I thought I was." The room grew quiet, except for the soft crackling of the fireplace and the whispered conversation of his nieces over their puzzle. Even they seemed to sense that the adults were discussing something significant. "How so?" Eleanor asked gently. Thomas took a sip of cognac, buying himself time to organize thoughts that felt too complex for easy articulation. "I always believed I was supportive of Audrey's career, her interests, her goals. I thought I was being protective when I suggested she skip events that might conflict with business trips, or understanding when I asked her to prioritize social obligations that would help the company. I told myself I was including her in my success." He paused, noting the careful attention his family was paying to his words. These were people who loved him, who wanted him to be happy, but who were also intelligent enough to recognize the implications of what he was describing. But tonight, listening to her talk about her life now, about her work and her decisions, I realized that she never stopped being herself during our marriage. She just stopped expressing herself, and I never noticed the difference. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the woman I saw tonight, confident, decisive, genuinely happy, she was always there, but somehow in our marriage, she became smaller, quieter, more accommodating. And I told myself that was maturity. That was us learning to work as a team." Thomas set down his glass, the cognac suddenly tasting bitter. "But really, I think she was just disappearing." Eleanor's expression had grown serious the way it did when she was processing information that required careful consideration. "Thomas, marriage is always about compromise. Both partners make adjustments." "But did I?" Thomas asked, the question coming out sharper than he'd intended. "Did I ever adjust my schedule for hers or change my plans to accommodate something she wanted? Did I ever ask her what she wanted our life to look like? Or did I just assume she'd be happy with whatever I was building for us?" The silence that followed his questions felt heavy with uncomfortable recognition. Thomas could see his family members exchanging glances, probably remembering countless dinners and gatherings where Audrey had graciously adapted to whatever timeline or social obligation Thomas had deemed important. David cleared his throat carefully. "I think," he said, choosing his words with diplomatic precision, "that you're being pretty hard on yourself. Audrey never seemed unhappy when she was here." "No," Thomas agreed. "She seemed perfectly pleasant, perfectly accommodating. Perfect. The word felt hollow in his mouth, and I thought that meant we were perfectly matched. But tonight I realized that I never actually asked her if she was happy. I just assumed that if she wasn't complaining, everything was fine." Sarah looked up from the puzzle she'd been ostensibly helping with, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "it's easier to adapt than to advocate for yourself, especially when you love someone and want them to be successful. But that doesn't make the adaptation sustainable long-term." Thomas looked at Sarah with gratitude, recognizing that she was offering him both understanding and gentle accountability. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you maintain your own identity while being part of this family?" Sarah smiled, but there was something rueful in her expression. "It's taken practice, and David had to learn to ask me what I wanted instead of assuming he knew. That was an adjustment period." David made a sound that might have been embarrassed laughter. "I may have had some learning curve about not making decisions for both of us without consulting the both of us part. The difference," Sarah continued, "is that we figured out how to have those conversations before resentment built up. Sometimes timing is everything in a marriage." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach as he processed Sarah's words. Timing. Had there been a moment when he and Audrey could have had the difficult conversations that might have saved their marriage? Or had they been too far down the path of accommodation and assumption to find their way back to authentic communication? "Do you think," Thomas asked quietly, That if I'd understood this 2 years ago, things might have been different? Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand, her touch carrying decades of maternal comfort. "Oh, sweetheart," she said gently. "You can't rebuild the past by understanding it better. You can only use that understanding to make better choices going forward." The truth in her words hit him like physical weight. Thomas realized he'd been unconsciously hoping that his newfound insight about their marriage might somehow create an opportunity to repair what had been broken. But Audrey wasn't unhappy now, wasn't struggling, wasn't looking for rescue or reconciliation. She was thriving in the life she'd built for herself and Emma. "She looked so happy," Thomas said, more to himself than to his family. "Genuinely, completely happy. I don't think I've ever seen her look that confident in her own choices." "That's a good thing, isn't it?" Margaret asked gently. "Yes," Thomas said immediately. "Of course it is. I want her to be happy. He trailed off, unsure how to articulate the complexity of his emotions. "You just wish you'd been able to make her that happy," Eleanor finished for him. Thomas nodded, grateful that his mother had understood what he couldn't quite say. "I keep thinking about all the times she deferred to my judgment, all the opportunities she passed up to support my career moves, all the ways she made herself smaller to fit into the life I was creating. And she never complained. She never even seemed to resent it." "Maybe," Robert said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd returned to the living room. "She didn't resent it at the time. Maybe she thought that was what love looked like, supporting your partner's dreams even when it meant postponing your own." Thomas looked at his father, surprised by the insight. Robert rarely offered commentary on emotional dynamics, preferring to leave such conversations to Eleanor and Margaret. But when he spoke about relationships, his observations carried the weight of a 50-year marriage that had weathered its own challenges and adaptations. "But that's not sustainable," Thomas said. "No," Robert agreed. "It's not. Eventually, postponing your dreams becomes the same as abandoning them, and that changes a person, whether they realize it or not." The room fell quiet again as everyone processed the implications of Robert's words. Thomas found himself thinking about the Mediterranean sailing trip he'd booked, wondering if his vision of solitary adventure had been another form of self-deception. Had he been planning to sail alone because he genuinely preferred solitude, or because he'd never learned how to share experiences with a partner who had her own opinions about what constituted adventure? "I think," Thomas said finally, "I need to figure out who I am when I'm not making decisions for two people." Eleanor smiled at him with the kind of proud sadness that mothers reserved for moments when their children demonstrated painful but necessary growth. "That," she said, "sounds like a very good place to start." 3 weeks after Christmas, Thomas sat in his corner office overlooking Manhattan, staring at a contract that should have excited him. The Meridian Hotel Group wanted to discuss a merger that would double Reed International's presence in Europe, exactly the kind of expansion opportunity he'd been pursuing for years. The preliminary numbers were impressive, the strategic advantages obvious, and the timeline perfect for capitalizing on post-pandemic travel recovery. But for the first time in his professional life, Thomas found himself questioning whether bigger necessarily meant better. His assistant Janet knocked and entered, carrying a stack of documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd been trying to decode her boss's unusual behavior for 3 weeks. "The Meridian contracts are ready for your review," she said, setting the papers on his desk. "And your 2 o'clock appointment with the architectural firm is confirmed." Thomas glanced at the contracts without really seeing them. "Janet, can I ask you something?" She paused, clearly surprised by the question. In 15 years of working together, their relationship had been professionally warm but rarely personal. "Of course. When you make major decisions about your career, your life, how do you know if you're choosing what you actually want or just what seems like the logical next step?" Janet studied his face with the careful attention of someone trying to determine if this was a philosophical question or a request for genuine advice. "I suppose," she said slowly, "I try to imagine explaining the decision to someone I respect. If I can't articulate why it excites me beyond just the practical benefits, that usually tells me something." Thomas nodded, appreciating the simplicity of her approach. "And what if you realize you've been making decisions based on momentum rather than intention for a long time? Then I guess you start making different decisions," Janet said matter-of-factly. "It's not like the previous choices were wrong necessarily. They got you where you are. But if where you are doesn't feel like where you want to be, then it's information you can use going forward." After Janet left, Thomas found himself thinking about momentum versus intention. For the past 20 years, his professional choices had followed a clear trajectory: grow the business, expand into new markets, increase revenue, acquire competitors. Each decision had been logical, strategic, successful by any measurable standard. But when had he last made a business choice because it genuinely excited him rather than because it fit the pattern of growth he'd established? His phone buzzed with a text message interrupting his contemplation. Margaret, Emma's first playdate this Saturday at Audrey's apartment. Thought you might want to know she's settling into NYC life. Thomas stared at the message longer than necessary, surprised by the small pang of, what? Not quite jealousy, but something adjacent to it. Margaret had apparently maintained contact with Audrey in the weeks since Christmas, which made perfect sense. Their friendship had never been contingent on Thomas and Audrey's marriage. But the casual mention of Audrey's life continuing, evolving, creating new routines and relationships reminded Thomas that while he'd been processing revelations about their past, she'd been steadily building her future. He typed back, "That's nice. How's she doing?" Margaret's response came quickly. "Really well. She seems to have found her rhythm with the consulting work, and Emma is apparently already trying to crawl ahead of schedule, according to the baby books." Thomas smiled despite himself, remembering Emma's alert curiosity during Christmas dinner. Of course she would be an early achiever. She'd inherited Audrey's intelligence and determination after all. But the thought also brought an unexpected wave of something that felt uncomfortably like loss. He was missing these milestones, these small developments that marked Emma's growth from infant to person. Not because he had any right to witness them, but because he'd somehow become invested in this small human's progress during a single evening. That afternoon's meeting with the architectural firm proved more revealing than Thomas had anticipated. The project was a redesign of the flagship Reed International Hotel in Boston, a property that had been in his family since his grandfather's time, the foundation upon which the entire business had been built. "Our vision," the lead architect explained, pulling up digital renderings on her tablet, "is to honor the building's historic character while creating spaces that feel completely contemporary. We want guests to experience both the gravitas of the original architecture and the innovation of modern luxury hospitality." Thomas studied the proposed designs, noting how seamlessly they balanced preservation with progress. The lobby maintained its soaring ceilings and original marble floors, but incorporated sleek furniture and contemporary lighting. The guest rooms preserved the building's elegant proportions, while adding state-of-the-art technology and modern amenities. "It's about respecting what came before while making space for what's possible now," the architect continued. "Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is know which elements deserve to be preserved and which ones need to evolve." The comment hit Thomas with unexpected force. He found himself thinking about his conversation with Audrey on Christmas night, about her observation that some endings weren't failures but liberations. Maybe the same principle applied to other areas of life. Maybe knowing when to preserve and when to evolve was a skill that extended beyond architecture and interior design. "How do you determine what to preserve?" Thomas asked. "We look for elements that serve both functional and emotional purposes," the architect explained. "Features that not only work well, but that create meaningful connections for the people who experience the space. Sometimes what seems outdated is actually timeless, and sometimes what seems essential is just habitual." Thomas nodded, but his mind was working on a different level entirely. How much of his life was built on elements that served genuine purposes versus things that had simply become habitual? The penthouse apartment where he lived alone, the social obligations that filled his calendar, the business expansion strategies that followed predictable patterns. How much of it reflected intentional choice versus momentum? That evening, instead of staying late at the office as had become his routine, Thomas found himself walking through Central Park as winter darkness fell across the city. The pathways were nearly empty, lit by vintage-style street lamps that cast pools of warm light across the snow-covered grounds. He ended up at the reservoir, looking out across the water toward the west side skyline. Somewhere in that direction, Audrey was probably settling Emma into her evening routine, maybe reading to her, or singing the kind of lullabies that would become foundational memories. The life she was building seemed so purposeful, so aligned with what she actually wanted rather than what circumstances had arranged for her. Thomas pulled out his phone and, before he could second-guess the impulse, found Audrey's contact information. They hadn't spoken since Christmas night, and he wasn't even sure what he wanted to say. But something about the combination of the architectural meeting and the peaceful evening walk had left him feeling like he needed to. What? Apologize? Explain? Simply acknowledge what he was beginning to understand? He typed, "I've been thinking about what you said on Christmas night, about losing the version of you that you were trying to be for me. I think I'm finally starting to understand what that meant." He hesitated before sending it, recognizing that reaching out to his ex-wife with emotional insights probably violated several unspoken rules of post-divorce etiquette. But the message felt important in a way that transcended social convention, so he pressed send before he could overthink it. Audrey's response came 20 minutes later. "That's a hard thing to realize about yourself. How are you processing it?" The kindness in her response, no judgment, no triumph, just genuine curiosity about his emotional experience, reminded Thomas of one of the qualities that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. Audrey had always been generous with her attention when someone was struggling to understand something important. He wrote back, "I think I'm realizing that I've been living according to a blueprint I created years ago, without questioning whether it still fits who I am or what I actually want. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," came her reply. "I spent a lot of time in therapy working through similar questions. It's uncomfortable but ultimately freeing." Thomas found himself smiling at his phone, struck by how natural this conversation felt despite everything that had happened between them. This was the Audrey he remembered from their early relationship, thoughtful, insightful, willing to engage with complex emotional territory without trying to fix or judge. "Can I ask you something?" he typed. "Of course. How do you know when you're making choices that are authentically yours versus choices that just seem like what you should want?" The response took longer this time, and when it came, it carried the weight of careful consideration. "I think authentic choices feel scary and exciting at the same time. Safe choices just feel logical. The difference is whether you're moving toward something you want or away from something you're afraid of." Thomas read her message 3 times, letting the distinction settle into his consciousness. Moving toward versus moving away from. How many of his recent decisions had been motivated by fear of stagnation rather than genuine desire for what lay ahead? "Thank you," he wrote. "This helps more than you probably know." "You're welcome." "And Thomas, it's never too late to start making different choices. Emma is proof of that for me." As Thomas walked home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, Audrey's words echoed in his mind with the weight of possibility. It's never too late to start making different choices. For the first time in months, maybe years, Thomas felt like he was walking towards something rather than simply following the path he'd always been on. The question now was figuring out what that something might be. 6 weeks had passed since Christmas, and Thomas was discovering that questioning everything you'd assumed about your life was both liberating and terrifying. The Meridian merger sat unsigned on his desk, not because the deal wasn't profitable, but because every time he looked at the contracts, he felt like he was signing up for more of the same exponential growth that had somehow stopped feeling like progress. Instead, he found himself drawn to smaller, more unusual opportunities. Like the email he was currently reading from a boutique hotel in Tuscany, whose owner wanted to discuss a partnership rather than an acquisition. Villa Serena represents everything we believed hospitality could be before the industry became obsessed with scalability, the owner had written. "We're looking for a partner who understands that some experiences become more valuable when they remain intimate rather than replicated." Thomas reread the message, intrigued by the philosophy behind it. During their marriage, he and Audrey had stayed at Villa Serena during their 5th anniversary trip, a small property with 12 rooms, each one unique, where the staff knew every guest's name, and the chef prepared meals based on whatever looked best at the local market that morning. Audrey had loved it specifically because it felt like discovering a secret rather than checking into a hotel chain. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "Please tell me you're not working on a Saturday," his sister said without preamble. "I'm reading," Thomas replied, which was technically true. "What's going on?" "Emma's having her first playdate today, and Audrey invited the whole family to join afterward. Nothing formal, just coffee and catching up. Are you interested?" Thomas felt his pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine or business stress. The idea of seeing Audrey and Emma again appealed to him more than it probably should, but he also recognized the potential complications of inserting himself into what sounded like a carefully orchestrated social situation. "I don't want to impose," he said carefully. "This is Audrey's event." "Thomas," Margaret's voice carried the patient exasperation of someone who'd been managing family dynamics for decades. Audrey specifically asked if you might want to come. She said, and I quote, "Thomas is welcome if he'd like to see how Emma's progressing." The invitation felt both casual and loaded with subtext. Thomas found himself wondering what Audrey's motivation was: genuine friendliness, politeness, or something more complex that he wasn't equipped to decode over the phone. "What time?" he asked, making the decision before he could overthink it. 2 hours later, Thomas stood outside a pre-war building on the Upper West Side, holding a small wrapped package and questioning his judgment. He'd stopped at a boutique toy store and spent 20 minutes selecting what the salesperson assured him was an appropriate gift for a 5-month-old. A soft musical toy that played classical melodies when squeezed. The lobby was elegant but comfortable. Original marble floors but furnished with pieces that invited lingering rather than demanding reverence. Thomas could see why Audrey had chosen this building. It felt substantial without being ostentatious, the kind of place where a single mother could feel both safe and welcomed. Audrey answered the door wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater, her auburn hair pulled back in a casual ponytail that made her look younger than her 35 years. She was holding Emma, who had grown noticeably in the 6 weeks since Christmas. More alert, more interactive, regarding Thomas with the interested curiosity he was beginning to recognize as her standard approach to new situations. "Thomas," Audrey said, her smile warm but carefully measured. "I'm glad you could come. Emma, look who's here to visit." The apartment was exactly what Thomas had expected based on Audrey's description. 2 bedrooms with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. But seeing it in person, he was struck by how completely it reflected this new version of Audrey. The walls were decorated with art prints and photographs, rather than the expensive original pieces they'd collected together. The furniture was comfortable and practical, rather than showcase-worthy. Everything felt deliberately chosen for functionality and pleasure rather than status. "This is beautiful," Thomas said, accepting Emma when Audrey offered to let him hold her. "It feels like a real home." Emma settled against his chest with the easy trust of a baby who'd never learned to be afraid of strangers. She was heavier than he remembered, more solid, and she studied his face with the kind of intense concentration that suggested she was filing away information about this new person in her expanding world. "Thank you," Audrey said, clearly pleased by his observation. "I wanted Emma to grow up somewhere that felt warm rather than perfect." The comment landed with gentle accuracy, reminding Thomas of their former penthouse apartment with its marble surfaces and carefully curated aesthetic. Beautiful, certainly, but not particularly welcoming to the chaos of daily living, let alone child-rearing. Margaret arrived with Eleanor a few minutes later, followed by David with his twin daughters, who immediately gravitated toward Emma with the fascination 8-year-olds reserved for babies they could help entertain. The apartment filled with the comfortable noise of family gathering, but Thomas noticed how naturally Audrey managed the social dynamics, making sure everyone had coffee, facilitating introductions between Emma and the other children, creating space for multiple conversations without seeming overwhelmed by hosting duties. "She's gotten so much bigger," Eleanor observed, settling onto the sofa near Thomas. "And look at that smile. She's going to be a heartbreaker." Emma was indeed smiling more readily now, responding to voices and facial expressions with the kind of social engagement that suggested she genuinely enjoyed human company. Thomas found himself making silly faces purely to provoke those delighted grins, surprised by how satisfying it was to entertain someone whose approval was based entirely on whether you were interesting enough to hold her attention. "The pediatrician says she's very advanced socially," Audrey said, settling into the chair across from them. "She's already trying to mimic facial expressions and responds to her name consistently." Thomas looked at Audrey as she spoke about Emma's development, noting the quiet pride that had replaced the anxiety he remembered from their early marriage. This version of Audrey spoke with authority about something she genuinely understood, without second-guessing herself or seeking validation from others. "Have you thought about childcare?" Margaret asked. "For when your consulting work gets busier?" "I've been researching nannies," Audrey replied. "I want to be selective, find someone who understands that I'm not looking for a substitute parent, just support so I can maintain some professional focus. Emma and I have a good rhythm now, and I don't want to disrupt that unless it's with the right person." Thomas found himself impressed by Audrey's approach to the practical challenges of single motherhood. She'd clearly thought through the logistics carefully, planning for contingencies without seeming anxious about the unknowns. It was the same methodical intelligence she'd brought to museum work, applied now to the project of raising Emma. What kind of consulting are you doing these days? David asked with genuine curiosity. Audrey's face lit up with enthusiasm. Mostly authentication and provenance research for smaller galleries. Last month I worked with a dealer in Santa Fe who'd acquired a collection from an estate sale. Turned out to include 2 previously unknown sketches by a minor impressionist that were worth significantly more than anyone realized. Like detective work, Grace observed from the floor where she was helping Emma practice reaching for toys. Exactly like detective work, Audrey agreed. You follow clues, research historical records, sometimes discover that a painting's story is completely different from what people believed for decades. Thomas watched Audrey describe her work, remembering the passion she'd always had for art history, but noting how much more confident she seemed discussing it now. During their marriage, she'd often downplayed her expertise, especially in social settings where business discussions dominated. Now she spoke about authentication techniques and market trends with the easy authority of someone who knew her value in her field. That sounds fascinating, Eleanor said. And it must be satisfying to work on projects where your expertise makes such a difference. It is, Audrey agreed. And the flexibility allows me to be present for Emma, while still using my education and experience. It's the best of both worlds, honestly. As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself observing the dynamics between Audrey and Emma with growing appreciation. Audrey seemed to intuitively understand when Emma needed attention, and when she was content to observe the adult conversation. She narrated their interactions in a way that kept Emma engaged while still participating fully in the family gathering. It was the kind of seamless multitasking that spoke to how completely motherhood had integrated into her identity. When Emma began showing signs of needing a nap, the family began the gradual process of departure. Thomas lingered, ostensibly helping with cleanup, but really wanting a few minutes of private conversation with Audrey. "Thank you for including me," he said as they worked together to restore the living room to its original order. "This was nice, seeing how you've set up your life here." Audrey looked at him directly, and Thomas caught something searching in her expression. "I'm glad you came. I wanted you to see that Emma and I are doing well, not because I need you to know that, but because I thought it might give you some peace about everything." The generosity in her statement hit Thomas unexpectedly. Even now, even after everything they'd realized about their marriage, Audrey was thinking about his emotional well-being, wanting him to be free from guilt or regret about her choices. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said, settling Emma's toys back into their designated basket. "Of course. Do you ever miss it? Being married, I mean. Having someone to share the daily decisions with?" Audrey considered the question seriously before answering. "I miss some things about being married," she said finally. "I miss having someone to discuss interesting articles with over breakfast. I miss having a built-in date for family weddings. But I don't miss feeling like I need to get permission to want what I want. And I definitely don't miss second-guessing my instincts about what's best for my life." Thomas nodded, understanding that she was being honest without being hurtful. "I think," he said carefully, "I'm starting to learn the difference between wanting companionship and wanting someone to validate my choices." Audrey smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman he'd fallen in love with 8 years ago. Intelligent, curious, generous with her attention when someone was working through something important. "That's a good distinction to understand," she said. "And Thomas, I hope you find someone who wants to build something with you rather than just fit into what you've already built." As Thomas walked home through the afternoon sunshine, Audrey's words echoed in his mind with the weight of possibility. Build something with you rather than fit into what you've already built. For the first time since their divorce, Thomas found himself genuinely curious about what it might feel like to approach a relationship as a collaborative project, rather than an exercise in accommodation. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to the email about Villa Serena, reading it again with fresh attention. Maybe it was time to stop expanding his existing blueprint and start designing something entirely new. Thomas stood in the Villa Serena vineyard 3 months later, watching the morning mist rise from the Tuscan hills as the property owner, Marco Benedetti, explained his vision for authentic hospitality. The April air was warm with promise, carrying scents of lavender and wild herbs that reminded Thomas why he and Audrey had fallen in love with this region during their anniversary trip years ago. "You see," Marco said, his English accented but precise, "my grandmother built this villa not to make money, but to create a place where people could remember what it feels like to be truly welcomed. Every guest was treated like family, not because it was good business, but because that is how you treat people in your home." Thomas nodded, understanding that Marco wasn't just describing a hospitality philosophy, but articulating something Thomas had been struggling to define for months: the difference between achieving success and creating meaning. The challenge, Marco continued, is maintaining that intimacy while having the resources to preserve the property for future generations. We need a partner who understands that some things become more valuable when they are not scaled up. As they toured the villa's 12 unique guest rooms, each one decorated with antiques from Marco's family and artwork from local artisans, Thomas found himself thinking about Audrey's comment about building something together rather than fitting into existing structures. This partnership wouldn't follow Reed International's typical expansion model. It would require creating something entirely new, a hybrid approach that honored tradition while ensuring sustainability. "I'm interested," Thomas said as they concluded the tour, "but I want to be clear about what I'm proposing. This wouldn't be a Reed International acquisition. I'd want to create a separate entity, a new company that operates according to different principles." Marco's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "You understand then? We are not trying to become like everyone else. We are trying to remain ourselves while becoming viable for the long term." That afternoon, Thomas called Margaret from his hotel room in Florence, feeling a combination of exhilaration and nervousness that reminded him of his early entrepreneurial days. "You sound different," Margaret observed after he'd explained the Villa Serena opportunity. "Happy, but also terrified. It's been a while since I've heard both emotions in your voice simultaneously." "I think," Thomas said, looking out his window at the medieval architecture that had endured for centuries, "I'm finally making a decision based on what excites me, rather than what seems strategically obvious. And that terrifies you because I have no idea if I'm any good at making decisions that way." Thomas laughed, recognizing the honesty in his admission. "For 20 years, I've been following a business model that worked. Now I'm essentially starting over with principles I've never tested." "Thomas," Margaret's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who'd known him since childhood, "do you remember when you first bought the Boston Hotel? You had no experience running hospitality properties. You just knew you wanted to create something that felt like the kinds of places our family enjoyed traveling to." Thomas did remember that decision, the combination of excitement and terror, the sense of stepping into unknown territory guided only by instinct and hope. When had he stopped trusting those impulses in favor of proven formulas? "The difference," he said slowly, "is that I was younger then. Failure seemed less permanent. The difference," Margaret corrected, "is that you have more to lose now, which makes authentic choices feel riskier. But Thomas, you also have more resources, more experience, and more understanding of what actually matters to you. If anything, this is the perfect time to take risks that align with your values." After they hung up, Thomas found himself walking through the narrow streets of Florence as evening settled over the city. The architecture around him represented centuries of people making bold, creative choices, artists and architects who'd risked everything to bring their visions to life, creating beauty that had endured far longer than any practical considerations that might have motivated them. His phone buzzed with a text from Audrey. "Margaret mentioned you're in Italy exploring a new venture. That sounds exciting." Thomas paused on a bridge overlooking the Arno River, surprised by how naturally he wanted to share details about his trip with her. Over the past few months, they'd developed an easy text correspondence, not frequent, but comfortable when it occurred. He wrote back, "Exploring a partnership with a small family property in Tuscany, very different from my usual approach." Her response came quickly. "Different how? Smaller scale, focused on authentic experience, rather than scalable profit margins. Probably crazy from a business perspective. Sounds like you're leading with values instead of just metrics. When did you become so wise?" Thomas found himself smiling at his phone. "I had a good teacher. Someone once told me authentic choices feel scary and exciting at the same time." "Smart teacher," came Audrey's reply. "How does this choice feel?" Thomas considered the question seriously before typing, "Terrifying," which probably means it's right. "I'm proud of you," Audrey wrote back. "Not that you need my approval, but I wanted you to know." The unexpected kindness in her message hit Thomas with surprising force. Audrey had no obligation to support his professional decisions, no reason to invest emotional energy in his career evolution, but she was offering encouragement anyway, not because she needed anything from him, but because she genuinely wanted him to succeed at becoming whoever he was meant to be. "Thank you," he typed. "That means more than you probably know." 2 days later, Thomas was back in New York sitting across from his lawyer and accountant as they reviewed the legal structure for his new venture. Reed International would remain his primary business, but the Tuscan partnership would operate as an independent entity with its own philosophy and financial model. It's unconventional, his lawyer admitted, but structurally sound. You're essentially creating a laboratory for a different approach to hospitality investment. The risk is minimal, his accountant added, since you're not leveraging your existing properties. But the profit potential is also more limited than your typical acquisitions. Thomas nodded, understanding that both advisors were doing their jobs by highlighting the practical considerations. But for the first time in years, profit potential felt secondary to the possibility of creating something meaningful. I want to move forward, Thomas said. But I have one more conversation I need to have first. That evening, Thomas found himself standing outside Audrey's apartment building, holding takeout from the Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date 8 years ago. He'd texted to ask if she'd be available for dinner, explaining that he had something he wanted to discuss and that it seemed appropriate to share Italian food while talking about an Italian venture. Audrey answered the door wearing a sundress that matched the spring evening. Emma balanced on her hip with the easy confidence of someone who'd mastered the logistics of single parenthood. Emma had grown substantially in the months since the playdate, more interactive, more expressive, regarding Thomas with recognition rather than mere curiosity. "This smells amazing," Audrey said, accepting the takeout containers. "Emma and I were just finishing her dinner. She's gotten very interested in solid foods lately, mostly interested in wearing them rather than eating them." The apartment felt familiar now, comfortable in a way that reminded Thomas of the early days of their relationship when they'd spend hours talking over long dinners, sharing observations about art and travel and the kinds of lives they wanted to build. As they ate, Thomas explained the Villa Serena partnership, describing Marco's philosophy and the challenge of preserving intimate hospitality in a business environment that rewarded scale over authenticity. "It sounds like what you've always wanted to do," Audrey observed, settling Emma in her high chair with toys to occupy her attention. "Create places that feel like destinations rather than just accommodations." Thomas realized she was right. During their marriage, his favorite business conversations had always centered around properties that offered unique experiences. Hotels where guests felt like they were discovering something special rather than just booking a room. Somewhere along the way, he'd gotten caught up in metrics and market share and forgotten what had originally excited him about the hospitality industry. "There's something else," Thomas said, feeling nervous in a way that reminded him of their early relationship. "I want you to consider consulting on the project." Audrey looked at him with surprise, Emma making happy babbling sounds that provided a cheerful soundtrack to the sudden tension in the room. "Thomas," Audrey said carefully, "I'm not sure that's wise. We found a good balance as friends, but working together might complicate that." "I know it sounds complicated," Thomas agreed, "but hear me out. Marco wants to incorporate local art into the guest experience. Not just decorative pieces, but educational components that help visitors understand Tuscan artistic traditions. You have exactly the expertise we need, and the consulting arrangement would let you control your level of involvement." Audrey was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the practical and emotional implications of his proposal. Emma chose that moment to drop a toy, causing both adults to lean forward simultaneously to retrieve it, their heads nearly colliding in a moment of unexpected physical closeness. "Sorry," Thomas said, but he didn't immediately move away. For a second, they were close enough that he could see the golden flecks in Audrey's green eyes, close enough to remember how natural it had once felt to share space with her. "I'll think about it," Audrey said finally, her voice softer than before. "It does sound like an interesting project, and I appreciate that you thought of me." As Thomas prepared to leave, Emma reached for him from her high chair, making the kind of demanding sounds that indicated she wanted attention from this familiar adult. Thomas lifted her, surprised by how solid and warm she felt, how readily she settled against his chest. "She likes you," Audrey observed, watching Emma grab Thomas's collar with tiny but determined fists. "The feeling is mutual," Thomas said, looking down at Emma's serious expression. "She's remarkable, Audrey. You've done something incredible here." "We're doing something incredible together," Audrey corrected gently. "Every day she teaches me something new about being brave enough to trust my instincts." As Thomas handed Emma back to her mother, their fingers brushed briefly, a moment of contact that felt charged with possibility, but also weighted with the complexity of their shared history. "Whatever you decide about the consulting work," Thomas said, "I want you to know that asking you was about your expertise. not about us. I'm not trying to complicate your life or create situations that make you uncomfortable. Audrey studied his face with the careful attention he remembered from their marriage, as if she were trying to decode something important in his expression. I believe you, she said finally. And Thomas, I'm proud of you for choosing a project that aligns with who you're becoming rather than just who you've been. Walking home through the warm spring evening, Thomas felt like he was finally moving towards something, rather than just away from his past mistakes. The Villa Serena project represented more than a business opportunity. It was a chance to build something that reflected his authentic values rather than his inherited assumptions about success. And maybe, if Audrey decided to join the project, it would also be a chance to discover what it felt like to collaborate with someone who truly understood both his capabilities and his growth. 2 weeks after Thomas's invitation, Audrey stood in the arrivals area of Florence's airport, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier, scanning the crowd for Thomas's familiar figure. She'd spent those 14 days wrestling with her decision, ultimately concluding that the Villa Serena project represented exactly the kind of work she wanted to be doing, art historical consulting that honored both scholarship and practical application. What she hadn't fully processed until this moment was how it would feel to see Thomas again, in the place where they'd once been happiest together. Audrey. Thomas appeared beside her with the easy navigation skills of someone who'd spent years moving through crowded spaces efficiently. He looked different than she remembered, more relaxed, less armored in the careful composure that had characterized him during their marriage. His shirt was linen rather than his usual pressed cotton, and his smile reached his eyes in a way that reminded her of their early relationship. Thank you for coming, Thomas said, reaching for her luggage without asking. How was Emma during the flight? She was amazing, Audrey replied, adjusting Emma's position in the carrier. She seemed to enjoy the new experiences, watching other passengers, listening to different languages. I think she's going to be a natural traveler. As they walked toward Thomas's rental car, Audrey found herself studying his profile, noting the subtle changes that 6 months of intentional living had created. His shoulders seemed less rigid, his movements more fluid. Whatever internal work he'd been doing was manifesting in physical relaxation she hadn't seen in years. The drive to Villa Serena wound through landscapes that Audrey remembered from their anniversary trip, rolling hills covered with vineyards and olive groves, medieval villages perched on hilltops like permanent sentinels overlooking valleys that had been cultivated for thousands of years. Emma was awake now, fascinated by the changing scenery visible from her car seat. She's very alert, Thomas observed, glancing in the rearview mirror at Emma's intent expression. Does she always pay such close attention to her surroundings? Always, Audrey confirmed. The pediatrician says it indicates high intelligence, but honestly, I think she's just naturally curious about how the world works. She wants to understand everything she sees. Thomas smiled at that assessment. She gets that from her mother. The comment was casual, affectionate, but it carried weight that made Audrey glance at Thomas more carefully. During their marriage, he'd rarely made observations about her personality traits, at least not in terms that suggested he'd been paying close attention to how her mind worked. This felt like recognition rather than polite flattery. Villa Serena appeared around a curve in the road exactly as Audrey remembered it. Golden stone walls covered with flowering vines, cypress trees creating dramatic vertical lines against the rolling landscape, gardens that looked both meticulously maintained and completely natural. But approaching it with Emma, as a single mother rather than a wife, felt like viewing a familiar painting from an entirely different angle. Marco Benedetti met them in the courtyard, his enthusiasm for the project evident in the way he immediately began explaining his vision for incorporating art historical context into the guest experience. As they toured the property, Audrey found herself genuinely excited by the challenges he described. How to make Renaissance artistic techniques accessible to modern travelers. How to create educational experiences that enhanced rather than interrupted the pleasure of staying in such a beautiful place. We want guests to understand not just what they're looking at, but why it was created this way, Marco explained as they stood in the villa's main salon, where 14th century frescoes covered the walls. These paintings weren't just decoration. They told stories, conveyed status, connected the family to larger cultural movements. Exactly, Audrey said, shifting Emma to her other arm as she studied the frescoes more carefully. And the techniques used here, the gold leaf application, the perspective experiments, represent a specific moment in artistic evolution. Guests could learn to see this room as a time capsule rather than just a pretty backdrop. Thomas watched Audrey discuss the artistic elements with Marco, noting how animated she became when describing the historical significance of various decorative choices. This was the Audrey he'd fallen in love with, passionate, articulate, able to make complex ideas accessible without dumbing them down. But now she was doing it while effortlessly managing Emma's needs, creating an impromptu presentation while a 7-month-old babbled commentary from her arms. That evening, after Emma had been settled in the travel crib in Audrey's room, the 3 adults gathered on the villa's terrace for dinner. The view stretched across the valley toward distant hills, and the air was warm with late spring temperatures and the scent of jasmine from the gardens below. "This project could work beautifully," Audrey said, accepting a glass of wine from Marco. "The challenge will be creating materials that enhance the experience without overwhelming it. Guests shouldn't feel like they're taking a museum tour, but like they're being invited into the cultural context that makes these spaces meaningful." "Precisely," Marco agreed. "Thomas, you have chosen an excellent consultant. Dr. Collins understands exactly what we hope to achieve." Thomas raised his glass, looking directly at Audrey. "Two excellent consultants and meaningful projects." As they touched glasses, Audrey felt something shift in the evening's atmosphere. Not quite romantic tension, but definitely a deeper level of mutual recognition than had characterized their recent interactions. They were no longer just Thomas and Audrey, the divorced couple navigating friendly post-marriage dynamics. They were collaborators, adults who understood each other's professional capabilities and were genuinely excited about creating something together. After Marco retired for the evening, Thomas and Audrey remained on the terrace, the comfortable silence between them punctuated by night sounds from the garden and the distant hum of conversation from the village below. "Can I tell you something?" Audrey said finally, setting down her wineglass and turning to face Thomas directly. "Of course. When you invited me to consult on this project, part of me was afraid you were trying to recreate something that had already ended. But being here, seeing how you're approaching this venture, I realize you're not trying to go backwards. You're building something completely new." Thomas felt something tight in his chest loosen at her words. "I was afraid of the same thing," he admitted, "that I was unconsciously trying to fix our marriage by creating a professional situation that would bring us back together. But I think what I'm actually trying to do is figure out what it feels like to collaborate with someone who sees me clearly." "And what does it feel like?" Audrey asked softly. Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. "Terrifying and exciting, and completely different from anything I experienced during our marriage." Audrey nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "During our marriage, I think I was so focused on being the wife you needed that I never really showed you who I was, as a professional, as a thinker, as someone with my own vision for how projects should unfold. And I was so focused on being the husband I thought you wanted, successful, decisive, able to provide security, that I never asked you what kind of partner you actually needed." They sat with that recognition for a moment, both understanding that they were finally having the conversation they should have had years ago, when the stakes were higher and the possibility of repair still existed. "Thomas," Audrey said, her voice carrying a kind of gentle finality, "I need you to know that what we had wasn't a failure. We weren't wrong to get married, and we weren't wrong to get divorced. We were just two people learning how to be ourselves, and sometimes that process isn't compatible with being married to each other." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes, not from sadness but from the relief of finally understanding their story in terms that didn't require blame or regret. "I spent so much time after our divorce trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I could have been different. But maybe the real question was whether either of us was ready to be married to anyone at that point in our lives." "Maybe," Audrey agreed. "And maybe the gift we gave each other was the space to become who we needed to be separately before we could figure out how to connect with anyone authentically." A sound from inside the villa indicated that Emma was stirring, probably ready for her evening feeding. Audrey stood, but Thomas reached out to touch her hand gently. "Audrey," he said, looking up at her in the soft light from the terrace lanterns, "I'm grateful for this project, for Emma letting me be part of her world, for you trusting me enough to collaborate again. But mostly I'm grateful that we found a way to love each other well, even if it wasn't the way we originally planned." Audrey smiled, and Thomas saw in her expression the same mixture of affection and closure that he felt. "I'm grateful too, for all of it." As she headed inside to care for Emma, Thomas remained on the terrace, looking out over the Tuscan landscape that had witnessed centuries of human stories. Love found and lost, families formed and transformed, people learning to build lives that honored both their individual dreams and their connections to others. For the first time since their divorce, Thomas felt complete peace about the ending of their marriage, not because it hadn't mattered, but because it had mattered enough to transform them both into people capable of loving more authentically in the future. And perhaps in its own way that transformation was the most meaningful success their relationship could have achieved. 18 months later, the autumn sun cast golden light through the tall windows of Villa Serena's main salon. As Thomas watched Audrey guide a small group of guests through the restored frescoes, Emma balanced confidently on her hip. At nearly 2 years old, Emma had become an unofficial ambassador for the villa, charming guests with her bright smile and babbled commentary on her mother's art historical presentations. Notice how the artist used perspective here to draw your eye toward the central figure, Audrey was explaining to the group of 8 guests. Couples celebrating anniversaries, art enthusiasts, travelers who'd chosen Villa Serena specifically for its cultural programming. This technique was revolutionary in 1380, representing a completely new way of understanding how visual space could create emotional impact. Emma chose that moment to point at the fresco and declare bello, with toddler enthusiasm, drawing delighted laughter from the assembled guests. Thomas smiled from his position near the doorway, remembering how nervous he'd been when Audrey first suggested bringing Emma to Italy for extended consulting periods. Now, watching his ex-wife seamlessly blend motherhood with professional expertise, while Emma charmed international visitors, he couldn't imagine the project succeeding any other way. The Villa Serena partnership had exceeded every expectation Thomas had dared to formulate. The property was booked solid through the following year, with a waiting list that included art historians, honeymoon couples, and business leaders seeking retreat spaces that offered both luxury and authenticity. But more importantly, the project had become exactly what Thomas had hoped for, a business venture that reflected his values, rather than just his ambitions. "Uncle Thomas!" Emma spotted him in the doorway and immediately began reaching in his direction, using the title that had evolved naturally over the months of their collaboration. "Excuse me for just one moment," Audrey said to her group, moving toward Thomas so Emma could transfer into his arms, a logistics dance they'd perfected through repetition. "How's the presentation going?" Thomas asked quietly, settling Emma against his chest where she immediately began playing with his collar buttons. "Perfectly," Audrey replied, her smile carrying the satisfaction of someone doing exactly what she was meant to be doing. "This group is particularly engaged. 3 of them have already asked about extending their stay to attend tomorrow's workshop on Renaissance painting techniques." As Audrey returned to her group, Thomas carried Emma outside to the villa's gardens, where Marco was overseeing the installation of new sculptures from local artisans. The partnership between Thomas, Marco, and Audrey had evolved into something none of them had anticipated. Not just a business collaboration, but a friendship built on shared values and complementary expertise. "She is remarkable, your Audrey," Marco observed, watching through the window as Audrey gestured toward details in the frescoes. The guests always leave feeling like they have discovered secrets rather than simply received education. Thomas didn't correct Marco's assumption about possession. After 18 months, the distinction between their professional and personal relationships had become beautifully complex in ways that defied easy categorization. They weren't married, weren't dating, weren't trying to recreate their past relationship, but they had become something rarer, true collaborators who understood each other's strengths and supported each other's growth without needing to define or control the connection. "She's always been remarkable," Thomas replied, lifting Emma so she could examine the leaves of an olive tree that had been producing fruit for over a century. "I just finally learned how to pay attention." That evening, after the guests had dispersed to prepare for dinner, Thomas found Audrey on the villa's terrace where she was reviewing notes for tomorrow's workshop, while Emma played with wooden blocks nearby. The scene had become familiar over the months, Audrey seamlessly managing professional responsibilities while staying present for Emma's needs, creating a model of working motherhood that looked effortless, but Thomas knew required careful choreography. "Successful day?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Very," Audrey replied, closing her notebook and turning her attention fully to him, a gesture that still surprised Thomas with its generosity. During their marriage, she'd often seemed to listen to him while thinking about other things. Now her attention felt complete, chosen, rather than obligatory. "I got a call from the Metropolitan Museum today," Audrey continued. "They want to discuss a consulting position, developing educational programming that could incorporate some of the techniques we've pioneered here." Thomas felt a flicker of something that might have been possessiveness, quickly replaced by genuine excitement for her opportunity. That sounds incredible. What would it involve? Probably 3 months in New York working with their education department to design immersive experiences for major exhibitions. It would mean leaving Villa Serena temporarily, but the timing works well with Emma's development, and the position could lead to permanent opportunities if I wanted them. As Audrey described the details of the offer, Thomas realized he was witnessing something he'd never experienced during their marriage, a conversation about Audrey's professional future that centered entirely on her goals and interests, rather than how her choices might impact his plans. "It sounds perfect for you," Thomas said, meaning it completely. "Museum work was always where your passion was strongest." Audrey studied his face carefully, probably checking for signs of the disappointment or subtle manipulation that had characterized his responses to her career opportunities during their marriage. "You wouldn't mind if I took Emma to New York for 3 months?" The question revealed the complexity of their current relationship. She was asking not because she needed his permission, but because his opinion mattered to her as Emma's honorary uncle and her business partner. "I'd miss you both terribly," Thomas admitted. "But Audrey, you should absolutely take the position. This is exactly the kind of opportunity you deserve." Emma chose that moment to abandon her blocks in favor of climbing onto Thomas's lap, settling against his chest with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned her welcome in his arms. Thomas wrapped his arms around her small body, noting how much heavier she'd become over the months, how her vocabulary had expanded from single words to complete sentences delivered with amusing seriousness. "Tell Thomas about your new word," Audrey prompted Emma with a smile. Emma looked up at Thomas with bright eyes. "Amicizia," she announced proudly. "Marco taught her that," Audrey explained. "It means friendship in Italian. She's been using it to describe everyone she likes." "Amicizia," Thomas repeated, testing the word. "I like that better than any English translation." As the evening settled around them, the three of them sitting together on the terrace while dinner preparations continued inside the villa, Thomas felt a profound sense of completeness that had nothing to do with romantic fulfillment or traditional family structures. This was something else entirely, a chosen connection based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection for each other's authentic selves. "Thomas," Audrey said quietly, waiting until Emma had dozed against his chest before continuing, "I want you to know that this, what we've created here, has been healing for me in ways I didn't expect." "How so?" "During our marriage, I sometimes felt like I was performing the role of wife, rather than simply being myself in relationship with you. But working together here, raising Emma while building this project, it's taught me what collaboration actually feels like when both people are genuinely free to be who they are." Thomas felt the truth of her observation settle into his understanding. "I know what you mean. For the first time, I feel like I'm contributing to something that reflects my authentic values, rather than just my inherited assumptions about success." And Emma gets to see adults working together with respect and affection, even when their relationship doesn't fit conventional categories, Audrey added. "I think that's a gift we're giving her, showing her that love takes many forms, and the most important thing is that it's genuine." 6 months later, Thomas stood in his renovated Boston office, reviewing reports from Villa Serena while video calling with Audrey, who was in her temporary office at the Metropolitan Museum. Emma appeared on the screen, now confidently walking and chattering in a mixture of English and Italian that delighted everyone who encountered her. "The museum board approved the permanent position," Audrey announced, her smile indicating how pleased she was with the development. "I'll be director of immersive education, essentially creating programming that brings art historical context to life for visitors." "That's incredible," Thomas said, genuinely thrilled for her success. "And it means you'll be staying in New York permanently?" "For now," Audrey replied, "though I'm hoping to maintain my consulting relationship with Villa Serena, maybe quarterly visits to oversee programming development." "Uncle Thomas!" Emma had discovered the video call and was now waving enthusiastically at the camera. "Venire Italia. She wants to know when we're coming back to Italy," Audrey translated, laughing at Emma's determined pronunciation. "Soon," Thomas promised Emma, then addressed Audrey directly. "Actually, I have something to ask you. Marco and I are opening a second property, a villa in Umbria that's even smaller and more focused on artistic residencies. Would you be interested in consulting on the cultural programming?" Audrey's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that told Thomas the project aligned perfectly with her professional interests. Artists' residencies combined with public programming. Exactly. a place where working artists can focus on their craft while offering workshops and demonstrations for guests who want to understand creative processes firsthand. As they discussed the possibilities for the new venture, Emma providing animated commentary from Audrey's lap, Thomas realized they had created something unprecedented in his experience, a relationship built on mutual support for each other's authentic ambitions rather than accommodation or compromise. 3 years after their divorce, Thomas and Audrey had discovered what it meant to love each other well, not as husband and wife, but as collaborative partners in creating meaningful work and supporting Emma's development into a confident, curious person who understood that families could take many forms. That evening, as Thomas walked through Boston's public garden on his way home from the office, he found himself thinking about the architecture metaphor that had guided his understanding throughout this journey. Some buildings were designed to stand for centuries unchanged, their value residing in preservation of original form. Others were designed to evolve, their beauty emerging from thoughtful adaptation to changing needs while honoring essential principles. His relationship with Audrey had turned out to be the latter kind of structure, not preserved in its original form, but transformed into something more sustainable and ultimately more beautiful than what they'd initially built together. And Emma, growing up within the framework of their conscious collaboration, would understand something that many children never learned, that love, at its best, was about supporting each other's becoming, rather than requiring each other's accommodation. Thomas smiled, pulling out his phone to send Audrey a message. Emma's right. We should plan another visit to Italy soon. There's still so much beauty to discover together. Her response came quickly. There always is. That's the gift of amicizia. It keeps growing when it's genuine. Would you have made the same choice? If you'd had the opportunity to rebuild a relationship with someone who'd hurt you, but who genuinely transformed, would you have found the courage to collaborate rather than simply coexist? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.